All right, well, thank you for coming today. This is a really great turnout. I'm Bill Duncan, and I'm the biological anthropologist at ETSU in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I'm happy to be here today to celebrate Darwin Day. This is a fun day. They do a really great job here at the fossil site, and so I was happy to come to the lecture. And today I'm going to talk about the evolution of bipedalism. And bipedalism is, of course, walking upright, walking on two legs. And the real reason I decided to talk about this is it articulates with this really fundamental question that people have always asked and sort of grappled with. And people certainly did during Darwin's time, and we still do today. And the question is, are we part of nature, or are we apart from it? Or are we separate from it? This is something that people have always kind of grappled with. Excuse me. And so throughout history, a lot of times people have tried to identify what is that one thing that makes us either similar or different from the rest of nature. What sort of makes us human, right? That's a very an old quest to find the things. Bipedalism is one of those things. That's one of the things people kick around. Other things include big brains. Okay, we have really big brains. The fact that we use language, the fact that we make art, a use of tools, manufacture of tools, or the controlled use of fire. All of these things at various points have sort of been suggested as this is really the key to humanity, to make us human. All right, and so this is something people are interested in. Today, there's a lot of these sort of different topics that sort of touch on the fact that people are always still trying to, not just in the past, but today, looking for anything that connects us, like these boundary lines, anything that connects to a boundary line between us and animals. And so just for today, I've not presented this data at any scientific conference. I collected some data about these boundary line phenomena. And you see them in your checkout line. These are full of this stuff, right? This is what people are really interested in. People care about this stuff. So ape gives birth to human babies, right? You've all seen these things, right? Where people, they're all over the place. So the newborn's doing birth. Bigfoot. This is about boundaries, right? We're interested in the idea that there's somehow some, creature out there that's kind of like us, but a little bit more like apes. And this is where the concept of the missing link really comes into play. And you're going to hear about that later. So, missing link, the ape-man baffles science. There are always these purient things. Whiskey, it's always drugs and sex. I don't know what the driving thing is, but anyway, that's not true. Anyway, so this is what people wonder about. We still wonder about these things. All right. And so the interesting thing about this is how you answer that question fundamentally informs how you view how we relate to the rest of the world, and it also impacts scientists about how we interpret things from the fossil record, is how you think about this stuff. So what I wanted to do today is I'm going to talk about bipedalism, sort of what it looks like in the human skeleton, and what it looks like in humans, and then we'll look at the fossil record a little bit for the rest of the time today. Okay, so I'll start at the top. Being a biped, we're not the only bipeds, and I'll show you some other examples later, but it is a pretty strange way of getting around. It's not all that common by and large. And if you start at the top, one of the things you notice is you're looking at the undersides of some skulls. And over on the right, you see that, so up here is where the face is, this is the back of the head, and this is the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord comes in and into the brain, right? Well, to be a biped, you have to have everything centered both front to back and side to side. Otherwise, you're not going to be a very good one. You compare that to a dog. If you look at the back of their skull, you'll see that their foramen magnum is at the back, and that's because they're quadrupeds. And so it's connecting in from a different angle entirely. Chimpanzees and gorillas get around in a really weird mode of locomotion. They're knuckle walkers, which you've undoubtedly seen at some point. But they're leaning way out, so their center of gravity is way out in front of their hips, right? And so theirs is somewhere in between. All right. So that's one way you can tell in the fossil record that you're looking at a biped. Another way is it's manifest, obviously, in the pelvis. This is a modern human down here. Obviously, this is looking at the front, this is looking at the side. And when you notice this, you have these ilia, the bones that you can feel out the side of your hips, and they sort of make a bowl. They hold your internal organs. They give protection to those organs. And one thing that's interesting about this is, well, let me compare it first up here to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees look totally different, right? Chimpanzees have these big blade-like ilia that you see here. And that's in part because they're leaning out in front with that knuckle. And what they need are these really big columns of muscle on either side of their spine to help that sustain that posture. Because if you tried to walk around like this all day, you would have a really sore back. That's what's going to happen. And so their pelvis works in a really different way. Now this is an Australopithecus afarensis pelvis from about 3.5 million years ago, and it fundamentally looks like ours. But one interesting thing is it doesn't look exactly like ours. And the reason that it doesn't look exactly like ours is they had really small brains. Afarensis crania, their cranial capacity was about 440 cubic centimeters, whereas modern humans is a lot closer to around 1450 cubic centimeters, okay? And so what you're seeing is all of these things that eventually came to be human evolving in different times. Does that make sense? And so, because if you're a biped and you have really big-brained babies, there's decisions that need to be made there, right? That's what has to happen. So you can have really big-brained babies that look like Charlie Brown, right? And they can come out, but you gotta have really wide hips for that, right? If you have really wide hips, you're not gonna be the world's best biped. And so it's a trade-off in terms of these selective pressures. And you see that going on right there. Okay, so that's the shape of the pelvis. The angle of the knee. This is another one that's kind of interesting. Obviously, if we stand together, stand over here so you can see, my knees are pretty close together, right? They come in at this angle called the valgus angle, and that puts your center of gravity close to your midline when you're walking. That's good. And also, when we walk, we have a relatively smooth stride, okay? As you're walking, try this sometime, put your hands right here on your hips, and when you lift up one leg, you will feel your opposite leg, the one that's on the ground, your hips are going to contract, and that's what gives you that stabilization, okay? That's part of being able to walk in a smooth line. Now, a chimpanzee, they don't have that same angle at their hip, right? And that's one of the reasons when you see them walk, I'm not going to do this one for you, they teeter back and forth, right? That's the reason that they don't make as good a bipeds as we do. All right. In addition to that, we have a straight knee. You can see this down at the bottom. We lock our legs. I don't do it intentionally, but they get pretty close to straight when you're walking. This is energetically a lot more efficient than if you're like some other apes and their knees don't really lock, okay? If you were to try to walk around and keep your knees bent like this, it looks kind of silly, but it also you can feel the muscles working a lot harder in a lot of different ways. And so we have this unique kind of bipedalism that's relatively efficient. And our feet. We have a toe, our big toe doesn't stick out to the side. Other apes, their feet look a lot more like their hands. They have a divergent big toe, okay? Which is great if you're climbing a lot. It's not great if you're a biped. Because if you're a biped, there's sort of three fundamental components to a biped stride. You have the heel strike, where the heel will hit the ground. You have the lateral transmission of force, because your arch is on the inside, and that's sort of like a shock absorber in a spring. And then you have the final, called a toe off or a push off with your big toe, right? And so we're really good at being we're not great climbing trees. These other primates are. And you can see this individual over here, I'll come back and talk about later. That's Ardipithecus. You can see that divergent big toe. Okay. So there's a bunch of different kinds of bipedalism, though. Like we're not the only bipeds in the world. This is one of my favorite birds. Anybody know what bird this is? What is it? The secretary bird. He's my kid. That's all right. That's a true story. We like birds at our house, and that's a secretary bird. This is a biped, though, right? But this head doesn't work the knees are not working. Our knees don't work like this. That's the way to say it. Okay, it's a fundamentally different joint. Other bipeds, meerkats, they stand up, right? They're looking for predators, right? They can, that's a kind of bipedalism, right? But they're not habitual bipeds. They run around on all fours. This is something they just do so they stand up so they can see if anything's coming, okay? T-Rex, you've got this enormous head, right? You've got to balance that like a seesaw with something enormous, this long, heavy tail on the other end, okay? And then you have baboons. They run around, they're quadrupeds, but they sometimes sit up, not to be bipedal, but they are in an upright posture. And that's the important thing. They don't just sit like this because they want to necessarily, but it allows them to use their hands to do other things, where they're eating seeds or they're scavenging like you see there, okay? So there's a bunch of different things that can actually put, you can get to bipedalism or a biped posture in some form from a lot of different directions. Now the question for today, though, that's kind of interesting that I think is worth thinking about, is if you were trying to understand how our bipedalism came to be, do you use animal models, right? Or do you try to think first about what is it that makes us human and work backwards from that? That's a fundamental question. And that has plagued paleoanthropologists historically. That's a problem, because we don't always know the answer to that. So some people have said, well, we stood up on the savannah so we could see predators. Perfectly reasonable thing to say. That's an animal model, right? That's something you could say works for these guys. Temperature regulation. That's something we know that matters for a lot of animals, okay? So if you are on all fours or a knuckle walker, you have this big surface area exposed to the sun, okay? Your back. If you're standing up, you have a lot less. In addition to that, standing up, you can catch a breeze, and that will cool you down also. So thermoregulation has been kicked around as a relevant parameter guiding the evolution of bipedalism. Energetics. This is a complicated graph, but basically you have down here body size. That's this axis. Up here, the y-axis, what you have is roughly how much energy it takes to get around, okay? And these are scaled. So the black line is running and the green line is walking, and they reflect average mammal relationships. So what I'm saying is this. Mammals of this body size take about this much energy. So small mammals take about this much energy to walk and run. Mammals of this size, much bigger, when they're running, they take relatively less energy. Does that make sense? And the green line is the same for walking. Now, bear with me on this. There's not a lot of these graphs. Bear with me on this. Now, if you look at the chimps, the green dot is above the green line. That means that chimps take more energy than mammals that are their size on average. Does that make sense? That means they're less efficient than most mammals their size when they're walking, okay? The chimp running, it's above the black line. That means when chimps are running, they're less efficient. They take more energy than mammals on average that are their size. With me? Okay, humans running, the black double square above the black line. Less efficient, but the green one, it's below the green line, right? When we're walking, we're more efficient, and we seem to use relatively less energy and require less energy than mammals of a similar size as humans. All right, that's what that graph tells you. So when you're talking about these things, this is the same way you would understand, how red pandas live, or how squirrels live, or whatever you're talking about. This is using animal models and concepts to try to understand this stuff, all right? Or other people have tried to say, all right, we're going to understand bipedalism based on things that really most other animals don't do, like carrying stuff around, right? Some animals carry things, it's not that we're the only ones that do that. But when you think of us collecting things, carrying things, using our hands for tools and stuff like that, that's when we start to think about it, come at it from the other direction of thinking of it primarily in terms of human activities, okay? Pygmy chimps do this, we know some. You can see that bent leg posture right here, by the way. That's, they don't really lock their legs out. So let me give you one example of what I'm talking about. When you start in terms of human behaviors today and try to work backwards and impose them on the past. This came out of the 1970s, and one researcher realized that when you start to see bipedalism emerge in the fossil record, you also start to see smaller canines. So you've got chimpanzee here, Pan, genus Pan, with this really big canine, right? Here you're looking at Ardipithecus, okay, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, okay? Much smaller canine relative to the other teeth. Everybody, you see that? Okay, so it seems to be there's this relationship with them coming together. This researcher said maybe that the reduced canine was a function of there being less male-on-male competition for access to females. He said, and that's a perfectly rational thing to say. Okay. So that's what he was saying. And if it came around at the same time as bipedalism, he said maybe the loss of that big canine and the bipedalism was because you had nuclear families that stayed together a long time and they had home bases. So maybe you had, the males would go out and they would hunt and they would bring back food to the families. That's called the man-the-hunter hypothesis. All right. There were two basic reactions to this. And this is in the 1970s. The first was, somebody said, yeah, that's interesting, but we know that there are some pair-bonded primates, namely gibbons, who stay together a long time, but they have really big canines. So you can find counterexamples of this. The other problem was, in the 1970s, the researchers who were women kind of hit the roof. That was not really appreciated at the time when they said the man the hunter. And very quickly there came a counter model called woman the gatherer that happened at the same time. But the point is both were working backwards to try to say, all right, what do we see in humans? Can we work backwards and talk about this in the fossil record? All right? And so that's a real different way of trying to understand the past. These are two different approaches. Okay. So with this in mind, the traditional narrative kind of looked like this. In the late Miocene, 6, 7 million years ago in this case, we started to see some deforestation in Africa. And it looked like you went from having forests that looked like this, with these big patches of forest, where you could walk around if you were one of these apes and really spend most of your time staying in the forest. By the late Miocene, you have this change in the environment, so you get smaller patches of forest in this area in East Africa, and you start to have to spend more time in the open savanna. Now, they may have been just trying to get back to forest, right? But they still had to get across the savanna. That was the basic narrative, all right? And shortly thereafter, you start to see sort of full-time obligate bipeds emerge. So, the traditional narrative, they come down out of the trees in the late Miocene, they stand up on the savanna, and there was different people who proposed different things. Some said it was carrying things, some said it was so you could see predators, thermoregulation, energetics. There was a lot of stuff going on during this time. Okay. So what do the fossils say? I thought we would take a look at two fossils that were important for this historically. Until very recently, this traditional narrative worked, and that was in part because it was supported by the data we associated from this fossil, Australopithecus afarensis. Australopithecines were the genus that preceded the genus Homo, which we're all a member of, and I suspect that a lot of people who come on a Saturday at noon to hear a lecture about bipedalism already know who Lucy is, but Lucy was a member of Australopithecus afarensis. John Johansen found Lucy in 1978 in the Hadar region of Ethiopia. And it's been found at a number of sites in Eastern Africa, and even more recently one that looks like it in Central Africa, but it's over there in the Rift Valley. Okay, so this is about 3 to 3.7 million years ago. And this is what Lucy looked like. Lucy was so important because there was so much of her. Normally when you're looking at these fossils, if you ask anybody here who's been working on these things, they come in bits and pieces and very small fragments. Well, she was 40% complete. And there's several things that you can tell from this species. The foramen magnum is centered up under the skull like a good biped should. You have a centered knee. This is the bottom end of the femur and the top end of the tibia. And you can see that angle coming in right there. See how that works? And you can see it over here where this femoral neck is angling that knee toward the midline of that body. Okay? In addition, you can see that she had smaller canines than chimpanzees. You're looking at a maxilla here, so you have the incisors, and these are the canines. And they're a little bit bigger relatively than yours and mine, but they're not nearly as big as a chimpanzee. Okay. So that's what we had. By then we said, all right, this is 3.7 million years ago. You've got this biped. That really works then. And the toes, when you look at the toes, they're all facing forward. You don't have this big divergent big toe. Everything sort of made sense from the traditional narrative. And there were other lines of data coming to this point. Because in the 70s, some people were still asking questions like, how do you know that was a biped? How do you know it actually moved around that way? And this is another thing that sort of sealed the case for this traditional narrative of bipedalism. These were like holy footprints from Tanzania. And this is also about the same time. And in a volcanic ash, there was very lucky to capture these footprints, okay? And you can see that there's this biped that walked through it, right? You can see a traditional heel strike, the lateral transmission of force, and the toe walk, which is a perfectly normal biped stride. Okay, so with that in mind, people said, all right, we have bipedalism kind of pegged. And then in 2009, this happened. Ardipithecus was published. Ardipithecus was a genus that was actually published in the early to mid-90s, it was 1994, and I remember actually I did as an undergrad, and I did a paper on it, and there was one paper on it, and they sat on this for years, until 2009, when they fully published on it. That was when it was probably you've heard of it, it was all over the papers at the time. And what it consisted of was one really well-preserved female and about 3 dozen other individuals. But the site was remarkable where it was actually found. And that was, they had like 150,000 fossils, basically, they were looking at. It was tremendous. And if you look at this, there's 2 things that can tell you this is very interesting, because it turns out this is a biped, but it's not your average kind of biped. It certainly wasn't a biped like Lucy. There's a couple things. If you were to stand up, my limb proportions are thoroughly unremarkable. And you stand up, if I have to scratch my knees, I got to bend something to get there, right? Not so for Ardipithecus. These are really long arms, okay? Look at the feet. See here. This is a biped, but one with an opposable big toe, right? It's a really different way of getting around on 2 limbs than traditionally thought about. So let me show you some things about it. What do we actually have with this? There are 2 species of Ardipithecus, Cadaba and Ramidus, and the one is roughly 5.5 million years old, the other is about 4.5. And the real difference is that the canines are bigger in the older one than the other one. That's the primary difference. But it's about the size of a female chimpanzee, maybe 50 kilograms roughly, 120 centimeters. But the cranial, it's got this really weird anatomy. So people had to go back and really rethink how we understand bipedalism as of a couple of years ago. Well, the cranial base looked like a biped. That seemed clear. It's got a broad pelvis that looks like a biped. It's got that weird big toe. And what they realized was all of the other toes were straighter than its forebears were. And by virtue of that, it seems to me they were using these other toes to push off rather than its big toe. You try it when you go home. You are going to try to not walk without using your big toe, and you'll get a cramp in your foot. It's a very different way of getting around. Okay, so here's what it looks like. This is looking down, or looking at the foot rather, and you can see the big toe sticking out the side. What you have, here's the corner over here. You have a modern human, you have a chimpanzee, and you have Ardipithecus in the middle. So you have very small canines, really big canines, and somewhere in the middle. Okay, you can see that there. You have a male and a female here of Ardipithecus, and then you can see this opposed, the yellow is an Afarensis pelvis. Okay, so what you're seeing then is a fully functional biped pelvis. Everybody seems to agree that it was bipedal. So how is this thing really getting around? What did that big toe that stuck out actually mean for this guy? Well, it seems to be, based on the wrists and other things, that when it was in the canopy, when it was up in trees, that it was probably walking around on the tops of trees with its palms flat like this. That's how it was walking around. Now, that's interesting for a number of reasons. Because if you think about apes getting around in trees, what is their posture? They're hanging below branches a lot of times, because this is big body apes. Okay? So what that means is These guys are walking around tops. That also means that they have to have really flexible wrists. If you try to do a push-up, some of you find it more comfortable to not put the bottom of your palms down, right? Because it sort of stretches your wrist out. These guys had really flexible wrists. You know who doesn't have really flexible wrists? Knuckle walkers. Because if they have flexible wrists, they just fall over, right? And that doesn't work very well. And so this probably, around this time, is where you start to see some divergence between Ardipithecus and what would later become Australopithecus in genus Homo, that eventually led to humans, and what eventually led to be the knuckle-walking African apes. You start to see that diversion around this time. So where does the upright body posture, how do you get from walking around on these trees, like with your palms down, then to being a biped? And the answer is, it seems to be that they had upright body posture while they were climbing. And they would have been very cautious climbers, is the way it's sort of phrased. And so you can imagine this thing, it looks about the size of a female chimpanzee, taking its time going up trees, and it was using its big toe to hold on to these big branches, okay? But it was that upright body posture in the same way that we saw the baboons sort of sitting upright, doing scavenging and eating those seeds and things like that. It was that sort of ancestral body posture that seems to have been so important when they came down from the trees and were walking in the savannah, that they had what's called a facultative bipedalism. That means that they weren't bipeds all the time, 100% of the time of their day, but when they were on the ground, they were probably using bipedal locomotion, all right? And it was this body posture that led to that. And that's a really different way of thinking about this than saying, well, they were going out hunting for their family, right? That's something that the latter really appeals to us, but it doesn't necessarily fit what we know about the fossil record right now. Okay. The other really neat thing about this was the environment. It wasn't just the fact that this was found on the savannah like Afarensis and some of these other finds. This was found in a really wet, wooded habitat. You had all these things like squirrels, and there weren't very many or much in the way of large mammals. In fact, there were a lot of colobus moths. So we know this find, Ardipithecus, was surrounded by these species and these animals that were spending more of their time in the trees than on the ground. Okay, so what that means then is bipedalism seems to have come about in a very different way than anybody originally thought. Okay, it didn't come about just on the savannah. So let's go back to the traditional narrative. We know that bipedalism seems to have come about in a wooded environment from a really generalized ancestor. You get around in a lot of different places. And that the upright posture was probably related to how they climbed in trees, and then sort of using their hands to keep their balance and their upright posture. Does that make sense? And that became useful later when they went down out of the trees into the savannah. And on a larger scale, this has implications for other things also. And I think the first is, this is Darwin Day, so we should go back to Darwin. And at some point, you've probably heard somebody say, well, people who study evolution, they don't really like Darwin either, because they don't really believe what Darwin thinks anymore anyway. And really, that's not really a constructive way to frame a criticism of people who study evolution and science in general. Because what you've just seen today is an example of the fact we're always changing our mind as we get new data. Okay, that's a really important concept. If you're not changing your mind about whatever you're talking about, eventually you're probably not getting more right. That's how things work in science, okay? And so this is an important concept. The other thing I think it highlights is you can have a trait or a suite of traits that evolve for one reason. In this case, that cautious climbing, where you have to use your hands to help you balance. It can be useful for a completely other set of purposes later, all right? And that's what this upright body posture seems to be about. It was good for a lot of things, from predation to carrying things, to thermoregulation. It was good for an awful lot of things. And then the last is that it is really useful to try to understand humans as a part of nature, which is not to say we're not distinct. Of course we're distinct. We're maximally distinct. We're not as different from anything else as you could be, but it's really constructive to think of us as a part of nature first when you're trying to understand where we came from, okay? And so that's sort of the take-home message I wanted to leave you with today. And lastly, in a shameless plug, I wanted to say thank you, but also, if this interests you, these courses are being offered at ETSU very regularly. This summer you can take it online if you wanted to. It's Introduction to Physical Anthropology, and we spend time talking about this and a lot of other things related to human evolution. Please sign up for that course. Thank you for your time. So I'll take questions that come up now. Anybody wants to ask questions about this or anything else, I can answer. Yeah.
So when we talk about bipedalism in the fossil record, could we potentially be seeing it develop independently a number of different times in different images?
The question was, can you see bipedalism emerge multiple times in the fossil records? Probably not. That doesn't seem to fit. That may turn out to be the case, but right now we don't have enough data before 4.5 million years ago to really know. Because I tell my students, when I was an undergrad studying this stuff, Afarensis was as early as it got for us. Since then, we've had multiple genera, but we only have fragmentary representation of it, so we don't know it. But bipedalism, this is the thing people wondered about, though. There's only a few ways to get to bipedalism, right? They used to think, okay, knuckle walkers, that makes sense as a way to get to bipedalism, because it's like an intermediate step, right? And that's one of the things about evolution, is that the intermediate steps have to be useful for something in order to get to an end goal. And there's no evidence that that's going on right now, that it evolved more than once. It's a good question. That's an interesting side point, though. Did it evolve more than once? And you think about the intermediate steps have to be useful for something, right? That is the reason that you don't have animals that have wheels, for example. Have you ever thought about that? Why don't jaguars have wheels? Why don't you make them faster potentially? The answer is because there's nothing so far in terms of these intermediate steps that would have been useful for something. Birds' feathers, we have those intermediate steps, right? They're colorful now, they're good for mating, they help them fly, but it helped them stay warm initially, right? And then it became about mating, and then it became about flight. So you can connect those things. And anyway, but there's only so many ways to get to bipedalism. And this is the one scenario that seems to work. But the question is then, could you have a biped come out 5 million years ago that didn't have an emergent big toe? And then the answer would automatically be yes. There seem to be multiple bipeds running around. Is that a question? Yes, sir.
Well, this may be a little far-fetched, but is there any evidence or any thought that learning theory, the organism learning that standing up gave advantage and began to practice that in some way or take advantage of it, and that was an impetus revolution?
Right. I've not seen that addressed explicitly with regard to bipedalism, but we know that learning is important for all primates. And we know, this is kind of interesting actually, because as we got closer to being humans, and for us, our kids are born big heads, they still can't do an awful lot, right? We have to really take care of that tremendous amount of investment. So learning was going on in a very intense way for all primates. But we have seen complex things be taught that only cropped up so Japanese snow macaques, there's this story of the different troops they were studying. Have you heard the story? I'll tell it for everybody. But the macaques were sitting there, the researchers were saying, all right, we're going to put some rice down here on the beach. And you see these macaques are picking out the brain at the time. There was one gifted and talented macaque who decided to scoop it all up, walk over to the water, do it like this. The dirt floated to the ground, she was able to eat up the rice by the handful. And her troop does that and prospered. Whereas there are a lot of other not gifted and talented macaques running around, they're still picking dirt out of their teeth because they couldn't do that. So yeah, learning matters, and you have complex things. But connecting that to locomotive changes, I haven't seen that around very much. Yeah.
I've got a brother-in-law who has almost an opposable big toe, which has always been rather strange in the family. And I'm a basketball fan, and I'm fascinated by some of these players that have huge wingspans. See, I mean, is there any possibility that's a throwback through the DNA record too? Or what's the
Okay. No. That's interesting because there's this fascinating guy who used to propose that in the 1800s, and his name was Cesare Lombroso. And he was an Italian, and he had this idea that you could identify certain traits. He was looking at criminals, and he said, based on these traits that these criminals have, I can connect that to earlier evolutionary patterns. And he actually, you may want to share this video of your brother, but he said he found someone, it was actually,
It's some brother-in-law, no blood.
Brother-in-law. I don't want to besmirch you.
That's good.
And he found a criminal whose toe was sticking out inside. And he said, see that? They're less evolved than everyone else. And so that's a really interesting thing that has been kicked around historically. But no, you don't. Now there is selection for body form and things like that. People who are from very cold climates tend to have very stocky, compact bodies, right? If you're from a very hot climate, you need to have a greater surface area to volume ratio so you can radiate heat. That's why if you're as big as an elephant, you got to have air conditioning. That's where the ears come in. You got all very little volume, lots of surface area, and that blood flow just come through the ears and radiate heat.
How, in the chronology here, what relationship is oppositional digits? What part do they play in bipedalism? When did they emerge?
Right. Having opposable thumb, now that's a primate thing, and that goes back 65 million years ago. And so that's something that is always is ancestral to all primates. So if they're able to do this, and the same with having nails, not claws, that's a fundamental primate thing. There's some primates that still have nails and things like that, but it's a very old for that. Yes?
You said earlier, cheetahs don't have heels. Have you
Yes.
ever heard of a heel spider?
No.
Alright.
I wouldn't have mentioned it if I had heard of the wheel spider.
It's not exactly like car wheels, as we would think today. It's basically it flattens out its body and then rolls down sand dunes.
I like it. Okay, so that's
And
good. That's it's like a roly-poly or a pill bug or something. Is that what you're saying? The way it gets down?
It wheel spider. And
I'll Google it. I'm not going to do it here, but in class as well. But there are other things. You do see very complicated things. Like, so there are insects that you see with almost like gear-like phenomena coming in together. And so there's always one exception to the rule. And I will Google that. But it is true, though. That's sort of a classic example. It's called the adaptive landscape model of trying to sort of have these things that have to connect in some way. Yes?
Is there any evidence that we may have evolved bipedalism because of how violent we are to each other?
Right. People have talked about aggression, as you saw, as being inherently relevant to our evolution. It hasn't come with bipedalism, but there are some species, notably Homo erectus, that has really thick cranial bones that people have kicked around and said, well, maybe it's because they were. I didn't mean that. In theory, they have talked about, theoretically, about the fact that was a defensive phenomenon. You know, so people have talked about that, but these are hard to, actually falsify. Yes.
Bill, could you come back to the issue of the canines for the Ardipithecus and how that might relate to its behavior, its diet?
Okay. There's several things that are going on. And basically, it seems that you had bigger brains and smaller mouths happening at once. And there's a bunch of trade-offs going on in the architecture of the skull. You're having the spinal column move up onto the center, the face is getting pushed in. That is presumably, a lot of people have suggested, the teeth get smaller as you get softer diets and things like that, because there are some Australopithecines that have enormous teeth, and they were eating really hard diets. But the smaller canines frequently is associated with aggression and things like that in a lot of species. So that's not inherently false, but there are counterexamples to that. And so I guess I would say smaller canines probably reflect social behavior as well as dietary changes, plus brains starting to get bigger, plus bipedalism. So all these things sort of fit together in this really complicated, thoroughly integrated way. Yeah.
Is there any advantage to having larger or smaller canines? I mean, the human mouth has always been a little bit of everything.
It's always been what?
Always been a little bit of everything. It's very omnivore, right?
That's true. There's been some suggestion that if you have unusefully large teeth, for example, then you can have, if you get infections, cavities, abscesses, things like that, that you're more likely to get those. And so there's been some, in modern humans, it's called the probable mutation effect. That's what one researcher talked about. And that you'll have, in the absence of some selective force to have these bigger teeth, there may be an inherent selection for smaller ones. So that could be.
Canines are also really sexually dimorphic in chimps, aren't they?
They are in a lot of species, that's what I'm saying. So it clearly is probably related to some social phenomenon. But again, there's not a lot of competition for mates and gibbons, but they still have a big point of canines. And so you see some counterexamples, but it clearly is related. Yeah. No, I thought you were doing all this. Okay. Yes, sir.
On the early humans, the factor of having a second set of teeth, why and when did that come into play as compared to our more primitive cousins?
Right. So the question is, when do you have multiple sets of teeth evolve? That was early. I don't even know the answer to that. But do you know when that was?
Well, reptiles do it over and over and over, actually.
Right.
And mammals just don't do it. Reduction.
Okay. And so my expertise ends when you get back before primates, to be perfectly honest. So it seems to be a mammalian thing. You start to see that. I will say one thing is true for primates over time is you see other reductions going on. Like the ancestral mammalian condition is to have 4 premolars, and we lose the first 2 over time. And so there's a lot of things going on. Yes, sir.
I had a general question about evolution being continuous or incremental. About how long do people speculate that a change like moving from all 4s to bipedalism might have taken?
That's a great question, and nobody knows. But that goes back to that earlier thing I was saying, like there's only so many intermediate steps. You see what I'm saying? Like you can't just come up 10 degrees every 100 years and eventually get there. It doesn't work that way. And if knuckle walking is off the table, and it seems to be, then probably it wasn't a long period of time. And this is why Ardipithecus was so important. Because presumably what happened was these guys were walking around, not nearly as well as we walk around, and then you would have seen relatively quick selection for the big toe to be tucked up on the ground. Because if they ended at 4.5 million years ago, certainly by 3.7 million years ago, Afarensis had a non-divergent big toe. Does that make sense?
Well, do you speculate that might have been because this upright had selective advantage and bred the gene spread?
Absolutely, yeah. And that makes sense, actually. If you've got these tiny little patches of forest, and you've got to get up in a tree fast, let's just say that, for a lot of reasons, presumably from predation you're running. If one person's toe is a little more functional than the other guy's, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just got to outrun your buddy. That's how it works, right? That's selection. And so that's what's going on. And so that presumably, I think that's the way, that's obvious.
Good possums should be as fast as racehorses. We run over all the small.
That's good. That's a good point, actually. I'm not a possum expert. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on the family? I want to say they were in Russia, where 4 or 5 of the kids in this one family walk on all fours. Have you seen that?
Turkey, okay. I've
Turkey, yeah. Okay.
not very much. I can't actually, because the other people in the audience may know more about that.
Yes, the doctor, did the whole, these people are regressive, evolution.
So they tried to make like an evolutionary U-turn, that's how they try to explain it. That's almost certainly not true. That's called an atavism, an evolutionary U-turn like that. They
But what
can't
it
have.
was, she had 25th and 21 years, and they were first cousins, and there was genetic problems within the family, and they didn't get any remedial help. And when they got like a walking machine to help them learn,
Right.
they all learned.
Okay. Can everybody hear that? It seems to have been something that was a case of, the question was there was a family somewhere, Turkey or where have you, that there was a bunch of children that were not walking around bipedally. And I only have heard about it, but apparently it was a case of a high level of inbreeding, a high inbreeding coefficient that was going on in that family, and there was no early intervention. But then when there was clinical intervention, that they were able to fix the problem. And that's actually, it's a funny thing, because you've seen little kids, I mean, I've certainly seen little kids that take a long time to walk, and they require some kind of clinical intervention to be able to come to that. Instead of crawling, they'll kind of scoot along sometimes, and some kids will, that gets fixed on its own, other times people have to sort of work with occupational therapy, or whatever the first word is kind of there. All right, well, yeah.
One last question about this dentation. Has there been any speculation about the third molar and its purpose, the so-called wisdom tooth?
Right. Well, what there's speculation about, there has been speculation about the wisdom tooth and the third molar. The interesting thing about that is Neanderthals have what's called a retromolar space. They have extra space back there. And there's two camps about that particular topic of why we all have such crooked teeth. And basically it's either genetic or it's environmental. The anthropologists who study that have suggested that it's not genetic, that it's environmental. And the reason, there's a lot of different lines of evidence that are kind of interesting. There's this one person I know, he saw a study for a heart disease study. So they'd given these baboons all of these really soft foods, which is butter, basically, whatever else they're feeding in this gruel. Very soft, tremendously crooked teeth. That's what is out from that. They've also looked in human populations, and like say in India, where there's still a movement into a Western lifestyle, and they looked at places where we already have a Western lifestyle there, which is to say cities. And then look in rural areas where it's still relatively traditional, and you're more likely to have problems with malocclusion in cities than you are in the in rural areas there where they're not soft.
But is it because our faces got shortened? Is that, and third molar, is that just sort of a vestigial?
No, that's been around. The phenomenon of that third molar has been around for a long time. You know when that evolved.
Well, so, yeah, what's really happening in humans is basically the loss of that third molar. And so the third molar has been throughout mammals, but it's becoming less and less common in our population. So it's not that the wisdom tooth is a new advancement, it's a holdover, it's a vestigial actually. It shows up well if you have enough room in your mouth to do it, and I think it has a lot to do with actually whether or not you are chewing hard foods, tough foods, like Bill's talking about here. If you grow up in an environment where all you eat is yogurt and things that are soft as yogurt, then you really don't develop the musculature and the bones as large as you would if you're eating the tougher foods.
Right. Yeah, stop cooking that. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope everybody